Hi, Assemblywoman Walker. How are you?
Awesome. I'm doing well. I'm excited.
Yes, this is exciting. This is, a very pivotal time in our communities for us to talk and get together. So we wanted to get started with giving a brief description about Juneteenth. Would you like to go, or would you like me to go? Who would you like to go? Do
You can go ahead and start.
Okay. So basically, Juneteenth is a 155-year-old celebration of the emancipation of slaves in the United States of America. It started in Galveston, Texas. Major General Gordon Granger, he announced to the Union Army and to the slaves in the Civil War, I'm sorry, to the slaves in the Civil War that slavery was over. Um, So what we do generally, particularly in the South as well, very much in the South, and I know it's something that we started on the East Coast as well, is we generally celebrate on the 19th of January. That is the day that the slaves found out that they were free. Hold on 1 second. Okay. Also, we have the fact that Lincoln himself had been actually assassinated a few months earlier in 1865. However, in Galveston, Texas, their history shows that a lot of people were moving their slaves towards Galveston, Texas, so that they could, they didn't know they were still enslaved. Is everyone able to hear me? Okay. So the slave people were moving their slaves towards Galveston, Texas, because that was a place that still had slavery. So that was part of why that's what the last slave holdover that was there. So as of 2020, 47 states and the District of Columbia, they all have some type of acknowledgement that Juneteenth exists. Recently, we know that Nike is making it a paid holiday. So I think North Dakota and South Dakota are the only states that do not recognize the holiday. So with that being said, we're going to have Assemblywoman Latrice Walker welcome everyone.
Good. Again, so thank you, everyone. Today marks the week where we are acknowledging our liberation. But of course, the question always comes back to are we really and truly liberated? And one of the most profound quotes that I've heard about this is that freedom isn't free. And while we know that slavery ended for us here in the United States on the books, it states that slavery was abolished except in the case of criminal punishment. So we have been living our entire lives as Black people, really continuing in this emancipation process. And when they say that, the individuals, the former slaves, were not even notified that they were still slaves, if you ask me, there's still so many of us, even right now, who don't recognize that we are still living in slavery, which is the truest existence of what it's been the minute you are subjected to the criminal justice system. And as we fighting mass incarceration all across the country, so when we talk about circumstances with respect to community and police relations, we are still talking about the institution of slavery. So I just want to be clear with that. So this conversation is very real, it's very poignant, it's very on time, particularly because of what we're seeing in the universe today. So I appreciate each and every one of you. I thank you for coming out with us this evening, and I hope that you can participate in our week-long event where we're not just talking about criminal justice or policy, but we're also talking about financial management, financial empowerment, and how we're able to control our legacies, which we recognize as something that's very important. So, thank you again for coming out. We have a great panel who is here with us today. Our first two speakers, one of them is Andre Richardson. Andre has an organization called Build the Bench, And Build the Bench is about really just how do we raise up the next generation of leaders to sort of take whatever it is that, however we leave our legacy behind for people who are coming up and interested in engaging in politics. What do they need to do? And Andre and I were just talking earlier about the fact that they call it political science for a reason, because there's a science to this as much as this art. And so we want to hear some of those facts so that people can understand that when they're tired of marching and they're tired of protesting, what else is there that you can do in order to affect change in your community? So, hey, Andre.
What's up, Assemblywoman? Good to see you.
Good. And thank you so much for participating with us. So, we had a little brief conversation earlier today. We recognize this very important point that we're in. And there's this whole process as to how a bill actually becomes a law. And it's easy to have this conversation as a legislator, which we'll talk a little bit about further. But a very important piece of this puzzle is really about the power of the people, the power of being organized, and how some of the process is fulfilled that maybe individuals may not have, been taught in civics class in school. So
Right.
pick for us, please, Mr. Richardson.
So, Assemblywoman Walker, thank you for putting together this much-needed forum around, such important issues. And I agree, it's very timely. And also, I think it really speaks to your leadership to discuss that elected officials and legislation is a source, but it's not the only source. So for those folks who are out there right now that are looking to get involved, there's a channel and a lane for advocacy, right? And that's what we're seeing right now in regards to police reforms that you and your colleagues passed, numerous amount of reforms last year in session. The city council is going to be bringing up several bills. Congress right now has the Justice and Policing Act that, addresses a lot of much needed police reforms, but it doesn't always have to be through legislation. And, that's kind of like, as we could see towards like the end of the road or toward maybe the middle, but the advocacy part and the organizing is the ground that is the work that takes place on the ground in the beginning, getting behind the cause that you believe in, kind of just looking around in your community, in your city, in your neighborhood, and recognizing what it might be that you would want to see differently. Here in New York, we're very attuned to the fact that the NYPD is completely out of control. The culture of the NYPD and their aggressive policing tactics are completely out of control. And that needs to be addressed in a very aggressive fashion. And that's why I applaud the three different branches of government as it pertains to where I live, taking swift action on all of that. Had it not been for the thousands of people who are marching in the streets, we might not see the swiftness in the bills that are taking place right now. If folks were not spending every minute of their free time marching, shutting down the Brooklyn Bridge, shutting down Flatbush Avenue, shutting down Fifth Avenue, we might not see the action that was being taken by the state legislature and your other colleagues in the city council. We're now talking about a chokehold bill that was introduced by Congressman Hakeem Jeffries in 2015. And the fact that we have Republicans talking about that now should be the only answer that we need for the question of why is it that you march? We march to bring awareness and attention around issues that are impacting our communities that we sometimes see before the decision makers. And a lot of times it could be a small group of people and folks will be like, they're crazy. Why are they marching? Why are they doing that? And all of a sudden we start to see it build and build and build. And then it gains momentum. And then from there, we have to be strategic and say, which committee do certain elected officials sit on? At what point do we need to then bring it to them? Is it public safety? Is it housing? Is it a voting reform issue? You can look at the chairs of these different committees. You can look at the committee members. All of the state legislature has offices in Albany and in everyone's respective districts and neighborhoods that they live in. set that meeting. These folks are not untouchable. You, for example, you're very accessible. Like there's never been a time where if I had an issue and had to reach out to you or somebody in the community that lives in our neighborhood that was like, how can I work on this? I would say, call the assemblywoman, and you would be receptive. And I think that's the importance of accessibility. That's one component of the advocacy. And then I think, the last piece is making sure that we ensure that that energy is transferable from activism into taking action around the advocacy, and then elections when necessary.
Well, I appreciate that, and that's positive. I see that we have Katie, who has also just joined us. And Katie has really been another very strong voice in Albany. And again, it's really, we are, as legislators, are amplifiers of a larger voice, and that's the voice of the people. And so I really just want to have Katie, who was with the Center for Community Alternatives, speak about some of the work that she's been doing as well in Albany. And the synergy between the two of you, I think, is amazing. And I'm really just honored to have both of you participate in this because, a lot of times people think, legislators will come up with these amazing ideas, right? But that they stand in front of. But many times there are bills and bill proposals that get, that are proposed, I'll use the same word, to the legislator to say, hey, we see this issue has been happening. We want to do something about it. We got together, we drafted this bill. Can you take a look at it to see if you can take this to the next level? So Katie, can you talk to us a little bit about what that process is like? If there's somebody out there right now with a burning interest in terms of affecting change by changing laws, like how would they get that done?
It's such a good question. Thank you for having me on, Assemblymember Walker. So the sort of first step is just to identify what the issue is that you're trying to address and making sure what branch of government is the right place to try to address the issue. Is what you need for Albany to pass a law? Doesn't need to be a state level law. Is what you need a local law? Do you need city council to pass a law? Is it possible that the governor or the mayor has the power to do what you want? Is there an agency head? And what this is sort of in organizing speak is picking a target, right? Who is the power holder who has the ability to give us what we want? And that's sort of the first step. Once you figured out that it's Albany, and I have to tell you, I'm born and raised in New York City, and I didn't get into this work, to be honest, because I cared about the rest of New York State. I'm gonna just be straight up. I got into this work because I figured out how much power Albany had over what happens here in New York City. I thought, well, if Albany is going to be who's in control of my city, then I got to do state level politics. I've got to build state level coalitions. I've got to build state level movements. So let's say you figure out, okay, what we really need is we need Albany to pass a law. Then you want to figure out who might, on the advocate side, sort of who are your allies? Who are some other organizations? Who are some other people who might care about this issue also? So you start to build your coalition. Now it's possible that you've got some capacity to write a bill yourself, which I, as Assemblymember Walker has pointed to, as sort of my preference. And then you get to figure out who in the legislature might be an ally, who has worked on these issues before, who, to Andre's point, sits on the right committee, who has knowledge about it, whose district is impacted by the issues you care about. Maybe it's the person who's your legislator, so they might be responsive to you since you can come to them saying, I'm a constituent. And you get them to do what's called introducing the bill. And you get one senator to introduce the bill in the Senate, and then you get an assembly member to introduce the bill on the assembly side, because the bill's got to pass through both houses, and then it's got to get signed by the governor. And then once you've got it introduced, you've got to build the power to get it passed. And that looks like everything from getting press coverage to holding rallies to bringing busloads of people up to Albany to talk to legislators. You've got to convince people to move on this issue you care about. And you've got to convince them both that it matters, But also, frankly, you've got to convince them that you've got enough political power to push them to do it, right? To Andre's earlier point, the policing bills that passed in Albany last week have been in the state legislature languishing for years, right? They didn't move. And if you had asked me 3 weeks ago, is the legislature going to repeal 50A? I would have laughed at you. I would have said, no way, that the legislature they're not going to do it. They're like feeling scared about a couple of different things. They're not going to do it. It took 1 week of sustained protest, and all of a sudden, that protest shifts the landscape so that something that was considered politically not feasible became inevitable, right? It became so clear that the legislature had to take action. And so that's the power. So see, Communities United for Police Reform, they had drafted those bills, they had introduced them, they've been doing all of the stuff they're supposed to do on legislative advocacy, going to Albany, bringing folks up, getting press coverage. They've been doing that, but they've been facing the unbelievable power and resistance of the police union. So they had been banging up against this wall, unable to get those to move. And then it was this unbelievable power organizing, outpouring protest that broke through that wall that they had been running up against, changed the entire political landscape. And all of a sudden, those bills that families who had their loved ones murdered by the NYPD, the mom of Eric Garner, the mom of Sean Bell, the mom of Akai Gurley, all of these families who had been working, this coalition of organizations, all of a sudden that protest allowed the legislative advocacy that they've been pursuing for years, allowed it to come through. And so we need both. We need both the street activism that changes the current, changes the political context. And then we need the folks who are writing the bills, who are figuring out how do we translate our demand into legislation? How do we get that teed up so that when we can build the protest movement, we are ready to move forward some concrete legislative changes.
So you have any comments on that, Andre? Because I was just gonna ask, I guess you can preface also your comments on this other question. So one of the things that you mentioned was about putting together coalitions and putting together press conferences. How would someone be able to participate in that process because there are a lot of organizations who are on the ground, right? And these are organizations who work hard each and every day, but they all remain nameless. No matter how hard they work, no matter how hard they want to be recognized for the work that they do, it's also very hard to get a breakthrough moment to even just be acknowledged in that. So for all of those grassroots organizations, do you have any advice to be able to let them know how can they participate in this movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I'm glad you prefaced it by mentioning coalition building. So there's some great orgs out there doing the work. Communities United for Criminal Justice Reform is a great group. I feel like this is an opportunity to plug the nonprofit that I just founded, and it might be malpractice if I didn't. That's called Build the Bench, which aims to bridge the political and generational divide in communities of color. And the reason why I'm glad that you mentioned the word coalition, because we're in a moment right now, specifically in communities of color, and more specifically in the Black community. We're seeing the misjustices that have been happening for decades upon decades as it pertains to criminal justice and police reform. There are issues with the housing system here in New York City that plague Black communities as well. There are issues with the education system that plague Black communities as well due to underfunding. I am beyond hopeful and optimistic that these coalitions unite and become even stronger around these unified issues of ensuring that the Black community has a seat at the table and progresses at the same level that other communities have in New York City, and actually even beyond. because there's a moment of catch up that needs to take place here for us to be ordered to, for us to have the opportunity to operate in a system that was not designed for Black people in mind. So now here we are with the awareness raised around police brutality and violence. That can be not just transferable to the political process in casting your vote, but that can be transferable to highlighting the to highlighting the inequalities in our educational system and the lack of affordable housing. Touching on your point very quickly, that was just mentioned about finding the right legislator that might push your issue. I think it's the back end work is also equally as important in terms of once you find that champion to champion that bill and then it passes. I think it's important for that person to be highlighted in being a leader, being a champion on that issue. And when other issues come up or other groups are over here trying to, and I've seen this and it upsets me, trying to vilify a certain politician, it's like, look, politicians are not going to be perfect on every issue, but we need to make sure that they're protected around certain issues. And it's highlighted when they have been our advocates and our allies. I think that back end work, and I can't stress that enough, I think that back end work is equally as important because a lot of times there's what I like to call a short-term memory and advocacy where it's like one minute you're a friend, the next minute you're an enemy. But I get it. We got to be out here pushing good policy and holding elected officials accountable at all times.
So I think that was also a good, kind of a segue to another conversation. Like once you found that legislator, the bill is introduced, but even though we, let's say in the assembly, the majority of the assembly is Democratic, we have a large number of Democrats all across the state of New York. We're also grateful to have the New York State Senate be in a Democratic majority as well. But the Democratic Party is not a monolithic party. And so while we recognize how important it is for us, I know now I'm threatened, but we got to speak truth to power. And that's really the only way that we can get these breakthrough moments. And so what are some of the dynamics that, you may bump into as you're trying to get through that sort of breakthrough moment in terms of, just the characteristics of the legislature? I don't want people to think that everything is peaches and cream because, when we're in Albany, it's still a fight.
No, and I think exactly to your point, Assemblymember Walker, is we've had a Democratic Senate and a Democratic Assembly for 2 legislative sessions. We were about to close out our second legislative Senate with a fully Democratic state legislature. And these police accountability bills did not move until we had a week and a half of national protest, right? And that tells you something about the ways that you not only have to get folks elected, but then you really have to put their feet to the fire. Because otherwise, the dynamic that we see is that the legislature will bend to wherever they think the political power is, and they will often bend to the members that they think of as being marginal. So in the Senate, that meant that the legislature was interested in supporting senators who came from purple districts, who had flipped seats that previously had been Republican. And so those tend to be more suburban and rural districts. They tend to be more conservative districts. And so it meant that when it comes to issues that matter to folks in New York City, but also to folks in Buffalo and Rochester that matter to communities of color, that they get squeamish because they're not sure that the politics of holding those seats matters. And we saw it. I've worked really closely with Assemblymember Walker on bail reform, on making sure that folks aren't locked up without a trial because they cannot afford money bail. And we watched, particularly on the Senate side, we watched the political dynamics shift so that the Senate was more afraid of the police unions who were opposed to bail reform. They were more afraid of the district attorneys who were opposed to bail reform, frankly, than they were afraid of us. And so we need to not only have good ideas and cultivate champions and get bills introduced, but we need to build, and I'm excited, Andre, about your organization, we've got to actually build the power to scare these folks, right? Like the legislature needs to know that if they don't do right by New Yorkers, by impacted communities, that they're not going to have their seats any longer. And we need to have that kind of scary electoral power to compel folks on these issues. I will do a quick organizational plug because Andre just made it acceptable, which is that Center for Community Alternatives is holding a summer organizing institute in the second half of July and through August. And that is going to be everything from how do you organize a rally? How do you organize a press conference? How do you move a bill through Albany? How do you bring your full power as an individual and your story to bear on the issues that you care about? And so if folks want to join us, I'm going to figure out how to share a link, but the address is bit.ly/summer-organizing. And we would love to have folks come. It's not a secret, to Assemblymember Walker's point. There's some science here, and that's a science that we want as many folks as to know as possible, so that we can bring the full power to bear on Albany.
Let me know how I can help.
Well, I appreciate that, because a lot of times, when we encounter people, let's say in the community, a lot of times it says, "Oh, my vote doesn't matter." It doesn't make a difference because politicians don't work for us. And again, it's because we haven't really figured out how we are empowered to be able to actually hold elected officials accountable to make them do what it is that the people need them to do, as opposed to going up with their own agenda. So I appreciate that. I do want to let individuals know that if you have any questions, you can pose your questions in the chat. There was just one question that I believe I saw, and it was about whether or not we could upload some of the information on the bills that were passed in the chat. So Renee, if you can take care of that, I would appreciate it. And so I know that you have to leave, Andre, so I don't know if there's any maybe final comments that you care to make, and then we will continue to highlight all of the great work of Build the Bench.
For sure. Absolutely. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I apologize that I have to jump, but I just want to echo one point that Katie was just saying regarding holding them accountable. In terms of voters versus elected officials, there's more of us than there is them. And it is important that we have our voices heard. It is important that we protect the integrity-minded elected officials that are doing the right thing day to day. And it's important that we hold the ones accountable that are not doing the right thing. Just using a quick example, I was having this conversation with a friend around what I believe are some reforms that can be more aggressive as it pertains to holding the police more accountable and addressing the issue of excessive force and the removal of CompStat, which we know measures police productivity. There's a different way to go about that. But then, the question was asked, well, what would you do for someone who lives in a predominantly white district, but was a Black member of Congress, the legislature, or whatever? And I said, when we're talking about reforming an institution like the NYPD or overall law enforcement as a whole, it's now the moment to be brave and to be radical and to address that, because that is not just a Black issue. That is an issue that is plaguing America, that if we do not do the work now, we will be doing this work for generations and generations and generations. And it's not going to get any easier. Now is the time to be bold and say, you know what? If I believe in this issue so much, and it affects my ability to be reelected, but I believe that this is the right thing to do, then let's just do it. Because that's the level of fearlessness that I believe is required to hold office in this day and age.
So,
and I know you got it.
What we gotta remember the mantra of Shirley Chisholm being "I'm bought and I'm bossed."
I'm bought and I'm bossed. That's right.
I mean, and that's the easiest way to do things, right? You don't have to remember all of those stories. If somebody comes, oh yeah, and just yes everybody to death, and you don't remember what you actually said yes to, that there definitely has to be some integrity to the process. But I think that the shift that we're seeing now is not just going to change the dynamics of police and community relations, but I believe that it's also going to change the dynamics of the people and how they see themselves in relation to their vote and to policies, and also reforming the way, elected officials respond to the communities that they represent. So again, I appreciate you. I thank you for all of the great work it is that you have going on. And we'll be back in touch.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Good to meet you.
Awesome.
BuildTheBench.nyc. Peace, y'all.
See if you can make sure to upload that, perhaps, Renee, as well. We also have with us Ashley Blue. So Ashley is my cohort, is my sister, because there is an organization that the Congressional Black Caucus has. It's the Congressional Black Caucus Institute. And the Institute is pretty much responsible for taking a group of individuals who are interested somewhat in politics or policy, and who really want to find their voice, and they train us to, how do we learn how to be political activists within a system of different policy institutions. And so Ashley and I took the course together, and she's doing some great work now as the political director of
Swing Left.
Say it again.
Swing Left.
Swing Left. And so the conversation that we were having earlier was really about the fact that this is a national movement that we're seeing taking place here. And we know that, it was a hard lesson that we learned, but we were warned that, elections have consequences. And we're seeing some of those consequences now that play out for us each and every day. But we have an opportunity to affect change even on a national level, now that we've seen what we can do on a more local level. So Ashley, can you just, kick it with us to let us know a little bit about what it is that you're doing and how people can really be empowered to be effective in this upcoming experience that we have going on?
Absolutely. Assemblywoman, thank you for inviting me once again. We've come so far. I serve as political director over at Swing Left, and we are a national org that focuses on swing districts and trying to win big races across the country. Swing Left came to exist after the 2016 election cycle, and started playing in the House. And so we were really instrumental in helping to flip the House. Out of about 80 or so endorsed seats, 55 of our folks got in. And so we saw some change happening there. And some of those folks that we supported were in New York. So we're happy to have done that work. And then this year we've expanded our focus because it's never just one election cycle, as Assemblywoman was saying. And so we are in a space now at our organization where we have a threefold mission, which is we are now focusing on helping local legislative races and making sure that we are maintaining control in state legislatures across the country. The census is coming up. And I know Assemblywoman Walker has been very vocal about the importance of the census, and we want to keep amplifying that. The way that we get fairly drawn districts is to make sure that we have good people in office who are considering the obstacles of gerrymandering that have been pretty systemic, particularly down south where I live here in North Carolina. We're the home of gerrymandering. So our friends in Georgia, our friends in Texas, they've got some big fights this year, and we want to make sure that we are able to support them in their local legislative races so that we can have fair lines in the future. We are also focusing on Senate races, and so there are a number of vulnerable senators this year. And on top of having to deal with the new environment we're all forced to live in with COVID, and now with the racial unrest across the country, where we are all fiercely advocating for some tangible changes, it gives us the opportunity to kind of pick off some of these folks who are sitting in seats that have been a long time red, and the folks are not voting in the way that we need them to in these states that need things like expanded Medicaid and things of that nature. And so the Senate is a priority, and then of course the presidential race is a priority for all of us. And we know that we've got a tough road ahead of us. And, I think we knew that this was not going to be an easy election year. We knew that since 2016. It's just the obstacles this year almost seem like they're unfair. And so what I want to encourage folks to do is, if you're not already involved in some type of organization that has civic implications, that has electoral implications, that have grassroots implications to affect our lives, think about the issues that are most important to you and find organizations that back those issues up. If environmentalism is what's important to you, there are environmental groups that are local and national that can help connect you with elected officials who align with your ideals. We're talking about Juneteenth, making sure that we are amplifying the messages of Black candidates that are running and who have difficult roads ahead of them. I mean, I think we've all seen what's happening in South Carolina with Jamie Harrison. That race is a long shot, but just having the energy that is behind him just shows that momentum will eventually turn into a seat for us, even if Jamie doesn't win. If Jamie runs again, because he's young, we're putting him in a better position in the next couple of years. So we need to think through how are we getting involved in the political process? Is it that I need to connect to an organization that's specifically helping Black people, brown people, indigenous people, people of color, and that is my pathway into having an impact electorally or on the census or whatever big issue is in front of us that particular week? That is the thing that everybody can do. And if you can't, and if you don't have the energy to participate in groups that will help you align and help you become effective in the political landscape, then just make sure that you get out the vote and make sure that you remind people that we need them to vote. The one added obstacle that I want people to keep in mind as we move towards November, we will be forced to have a myriad of options to vote. New York, you guys don't have as many obstacles as we do in the South, but making sure that folks understand how to access the absentee ballot, being prepared for longer lines, because we're going to have to combat with CDC guidelines in our polling places. Our volunteers that typically help, particularly in the progressive movement or the Democratic space, trend older. And so a lot of those folks can't do the jobs that they've traditionally done in their neighborhoods for years and even decades. And so there's a big shift happening in the movement. And I just encourage folks to find the thing that excites them and find a way to use that as a tool to get connected to issues that help us make incremental and big changes across the board.
That's great. And it's funny. I'm having a little technical difficulty, but I'm working it out.
Take your time.
It's funny that, people, I was sharing this with Councilwoman Alika Samuel today, because there is this tendency for folk, particularly, down south. I'm from South Carolina, where there's voter ID laws. And so people don't look at New York State or New York City as having a lot of those same problems. However, just this year, and during the pandemic, the governor basically, through executive order, allowed for absentee vote by mail, if you will. And what the process was is people were automatically sent a application for a ballot. It was pre-filled, I mean, it was amazing. You think like we finally arrived. But there's so many individuals who filled out that form, whether when they received it or if they did it online, and they still have not received their ballots. And the election is in a couple of days on June 23rd. And so now we have to have conversations about what are some of those inadequacies within the Board of Elections that allow for, something like this to happen. And then how do we get individuals to sort of come out and do some of the early voting? Like this is I think our second opportunity at early voting. But because people are not acclimated yet into going down and voting early, and there was a certain ebb and flow with respect to elections that people were used to. Now, you can do something different. And then the election date was changed, right? So we were used to voting for primaries in September. So everyone had the benefit of, the summer and knocking on doors and going to train stations, or the Labor Day parade even, and just being out in the community and meeting with constituencies. But all of those dynamics have changed. So when you couple an early election date, new processes for voting, and then, all of these other inconsistencies within the institutions because things are new for them, it's setting us back, 100 years, all over again. Because now voting is not easy anymore, and it's very hard to figure out some of those dynamics. So how do you deal, in those circumstances? And I'm sure they're very frustrating for you, but what are some of your suggestions that maybe we may be able to do coming out of this?
Ooh, that's a great question. The first thing is we have to be over prepared and we have to be ready for everything. What COVID has shown us is that a lot of the arguments that these majority Republican legislatures have been holding up for decades, saying how difficult it is to provide access to absentee voting or early voting, we now realize that was all fluff. That was just nonsense, because when we were faced with a pandemic, we had to flip the switch. A great example here in North Carolina, we had a very similar process where you have to request your ballot and then you fill out your ballot and return it. And no one else can help you fill out the request form. It cannot be pre-filled. It did not have a prepaid stamp on it. It didn't have the address on it. And so it required the voter to take a lot of responsibility in finding that information and getting it in the mailbox. And then once their ballot returns, okay, now you got to fill it out and put it back in there with no prepaid postage. And so you're seeing that that obstacle has now been torn down, where literally overnight our state legislature voted to make online voter registration a thing. And you can register online and you can request a lot simpler process online, and all of those faux rules just fell out of line. And so it just requires us to be over prepared and continue to ask these questions, because what will happen is, I'm now learning that the science of politics, as you were referring to earlier, at some point the opportunity will reveal itself. And no one could have expected that we would have this opportunity to expand our voting rights. Again, a lot of these online voter registration access, requesting absentee ballots, or mailing them to every registered voter, these were taboo topics 4 months ago. And so the floodgates have opened in that respect. The other things that we can do to prepare, again, if that means request your ballot, and then if your absentee ballot, like folks in this chat are saying, you haven't gotten it yet and the primary date is pulling up, or if we get to the general election and that date is pulling up and you haven't gotten that ballot, be prepared to go to the polling site. If you have early voting, look at our friends in Georgia. Do not take what happened to Georgia lightly. You may need to pack a snack. You might need to pack an umbrella. Like, these are going to be dire circumstances. And consider also our friends in Wisconsin with the Supreme Court election that they had a couple months ago as well, which was right in the middle of the COVID shutdown. And they had to get folks to the polls. And people put themselves at risk because they knew that they needed that Supreme Court seat in order to see change across the state. And that's their opportunity to get a lot of progressive things pushed through the finish line. And so we have to be over prepared for election day, unfortunately. I encourage everybody with access to go out and early vote, do it. As you were saying, Latrice, it does take some time for it to get to become a habit. North Carolina started early voting in 2008, and now you could not convince us to do anything otherwise. So if you have it in your community, use it, because we don't know what's going to happen on election day, and encourage the people that you know to do the same, because we're all going to be in a long line one way or the other. It's either going to be us tracking an absentee ballot trying to get to our house, or us trying to stand in a line and make sure that we can actually get our stuff scanned in. So over preparedness is the big word I would stress there.
That's great. And since we're talking about, Juneteenth, and really the significance of what that means for Black people, it's about just being politically empowered, as much as we're sort of empowered within our local communities. So it does make a difference when you are electing more Black men and Black women to particular seats, because we can't continue to find ourselves in positions where we are looking to other communities to really fight for our issues, when we're at the same time having to fight them to fight for us, and when we can just be electing people who just get it and understand, because it's just as much a part of their DNA as it is ours. So I appreciate you mentioning the race that's down in South Carolina, and really sort of the uphill battle that he is involved in, simply because, a Black man perhaps running as a Democrat in South Carolina isn't necessarily an in vogue topic. It wasn't when the Republican ran, but he was able to make some inroads there as well. But one of the things that, is that will become important for our political empowerment is to turn all of the activism that we're seeing across the country to get people to recognize how valuable the vote is. And so, do you sense that perhaps we can get maybe a breakthrough moment there? Like, how do you find, like, if you see a group, 5,000 people standing outside the state house, yelling at, the building and the bricks, how do you say to them, you don't have to yell anymore? Now take this ballot, and you go and you yell, and you utilize that level of empowerment to get what you want. Like, where do you find your organizing in the middle of all of this excitement that's happening?
That's another good question. I tend to remember that folks don't understand all of the things that we vote for. I think they understand that we vote for the president every 4 years. They might even understand that they have to vote for their assembly members. Y'all every 2 years, right?
Yes.
They might remember that. They might remember that their governor is every 4 years. Like, and they don't remember that you elect your sheriff. They don't remember that you elect your DA. And these are things that are in our control. And so the things that I use, particularly in this moment where we are trying to uplift Black people, one, remind folks that there's probably someone among you who should run. I know when we went to CBC boot camp in 2009, Latrice had dreams of being an assemblywoman, but that took some work. That took some investment. That took some experience in order to get you into that position. And you also have to build a network that's going to help you fundraise and all these fun things. We need to make sure that we are empowering people around us who have the courage to run, to make sure that we're building an infrastructure. And that could be as simple as helping, if this is a young person that's running and they have a young family, helping them with babysitting, helping them coordinate their schedule, offering to pick them up and drop them off to events. You know, it's really simple community stuff like that, where if you see somebody who you think would make a good elected official on the local, on the statewide, on the national level, give them the space to do that. For folks who are not typically voters, reminding them that, hey, that DA, that sheriff, those are the folks that we vote for when we go to the precinct. It's not just the presidential candidates. And so keeping that in mind, remember your school board candidates. If your school system is still jacked up, reminding people, hey, if your kids are in the school system, you need to be voting on the people who are on the board. And a lot of times there's some really weird people that run for school board just because they know they can get the votes. And, you know, that's pretty much for any seat, but that's another conversation. The other thing is, again, amplifying the fact that for folks who are regular voters this year, that we do have new obstacles and we just need to be over prepared. And so having those conversations with our elders and making sure that they are being safe and they're not putting themselves at risk, making sure that they have access to transportation, particularly in metro areas where your public transportation may not be on the same schedules that it was. Some precincts and polling places may change this year because we don't have as much capacity as we typically do because of this virus. And so there are some outside of the norm things that we really can't prepare for. We just know that we have a lot of curveballs coming our way. And so all that we can do is just be over prepared for everything, and continue to amplify to folks that listen. A lot of these people in your local government that you want to get rid of, we can. And it may not be that you go and vote them out the first time. It might take a couple of tries and finding the right candidate to really stick to them. But keep working on that platform that fits your community. Keep working on the issues that you know are going to galvanize support. And you be a supporter of those things too. And that's how you get to see these changes happen over time.
Well, I see that we were also joined by Attorney Kenneth Montgomery. And so, and it was almost as if we had sent you a telepathic message about what would be the perfect segue into his conversation with us. But what you mentioned was, you know, you do have an opportunity to you know, vote for president, but then there are these other implications that one vote may have, and there's these other layers of government that we always have to be cognizant of. And Attorney Montgomery has a very, very prolific criminal law practice, among other things. But there's just some circumstances that he, I'm sure, have run across with respect to judges, and some judges are elected, some are appointed. And so we, particularly with our federal courts, there's been a whirlwind taking place there. So Kenneth, if you know, introduce
Good evening,
yourself.
everybody. How are you? Kenneth
You.
Montgomery. I just wanted to follow up on something Ms. Blues just said, which I think is very important. You know, voting is a tool. It's an organizational tool. You know, many people before us, elders, talked about that. People like Stokely Carmichael and others. And unfortunately, our community obviously it's been fragmented, purposefully fragmented. One of the things that I think is very important is that we have to begin to nurture and produce the leadership from our communities that would run for sheriff, would run for judge, would run for city council, would see the importance of getting on the educational, the community board, the education board. There's so many different things. You know, we're in New York, so it's almost like a maze, all these positions. But, you know, if we're not mentoring, nurturing those people, it's really difficult to galvanize the community to vote for someone who is coming from outside of that community and saying, hey, I got your best interests. And I think that's something that's very important. And I think that nurturing process really starts from a cultural and educational standpoint from the very beginning in your own community, which is the educational system is very, very important. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes. But I just wanted to say that. For me, you know, I've served on a few of the judiciary screening committees here in Kings County. I'm here to tell you that I cannot name more than one Black male judge sitting in criminal court or in the criminal side of things, and that's Craig Walker, beautiful judge. Other than Craig Walker, there is none in Brooklyn. In Manhattan, I think the one that was sitting is now sitting in the Bronx. There's a few. I think the Bronx currently holds the most Black male judges. Queens, I know there's Kenny Holder and there's Judge Lewis. There's not a lot, and I say that to say that there's not a lot of representation in that. And in New York, at least, I think a big part of that problem is an economic problem. Economics have come into play in running for an elected office in the New York City system, particularly in for judgeship. And I think that needs to change. And I think there's ways to change that. But I think for us to change that, we kind of have to close the doors. There's something about our experience as Black people. We built this country. We built the cogs of industrialism in the Western world. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to control our ecosystem for whatever reason or another. But we have done that. And as a result, we have been alienated politically, socially, and economically. And if it's not for the hard work of people like yourself, Latrice, and other elected officials, and Ms. Blue, and people who work behind the scenes, but we have to change the apparatus in which how we intersect or interact, I should say, with this political process, because it's really meant to distract us or send us around or down the wrong path. So, you know, I have many thoughts, so I don't want to, you know, get on the speaker box. I'll wait for your question. Oh, I can't hear.
That's my fault.
All right.
What you said really just brings a lot of things into perspective. So what we're, you know, in the process now of sort of breaking down strongholds around our community and really around just us realizing the freedom that we believe we enjoyed from Juneteenth. And one of the things that when we opened up, you know, we recognize it in the Constitution. It tells us that slavery is abolished except in the case of criminal punishment. So what it sounds like I've heard from you is that one of the gatekeepers to that entryway, to that sort of proverbial door of no return, is our court system. And we have the power to be able to elect individuals or appoint individuals who, you know, share our ideals. I'll never forget, there's this one conversation that I had with Judge Shears. And
Robin Shears?
Yes. and she and I were speaking about a case where I believe it was a robbery case. And in this case, the defendant was basically like, you know, I wasn't there. I went to the store to the Chinese restaurant to get chicken wings and French fries. And so in order for him to be able to prove his case, he had to convince a jury, and I'm sure the judge as well, that you can go to the Chinese restaurant in certain communities and get French fries and chicken wings, which there's only a certain level of cultural competency that will really, you know, look at that and say, okay, yeah, that's probably where he went. So it's very important for us to sort of build out the bench to also be as reflective in our political campaigns as when we think about our city, state, and federal elected officials. But there's also a number of federal judicial appointments that are being made now. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the implications there and who's making these appointments and why we weren't able to get, you know, President Obama's appointment on the bench?
All right. Well, I think who makes those federal appointments, even let's talk about it. The district appointments are lifetime appointments. And here's something. This is my personal opinion, and I'll move on. I'll try to make it as quickly as possible. I don't think in any civilized society you should have a lifetime appointment for judges. Period. I think that opens the door for corruption. It opens the door for many things. The same things that people say why you should have it. I don't believe you should have lifetime appointments for any judge, Supreme or district judge. But here we are. I think Obama suffered from being a great American president, which we are traditionally used to being in whiteface, but he was in blackface. And I think that really curated the decisions that he made. And he left that judicial appointment out there. And lo and behold, listen, a lot of people, if you're paying attention in history and what's going on around you, I think it was really, for me, I knew Trump was going to beat Hillary. Not because clearly he wasn't smarter than her, he wasn't more qualified for than her, but because of racism and the DNA of racism in this country's history, I knew the majority of white people, just like the Reconstruction period, what was a backlash. They looked at Obama as, it was racial. So I knew he was going to win. And I think the Republican Party was very in sync, and they knew the importance of holding out and stonewalling him, because they knew that once Trump gets in, he has the ability to appoint hundreds of federal judges, hundreds. And these people that he are appointing are youthful. They're in their 40s, some are in their 30s, and they're going to be on that bench. You're talking 10, 20, 30 years for some of them. And in that time period, if you study American history, the one vanguard to make sure the status quo remains the same, to make sure that racism still is a tool for white supremacy, and make sure that black people are still denied the things that they should not be denied, the legal system is the way to do it. And they understood that. And they understood that to continue the legacy of choosing government over the average citizen and choosing corporations over consumers had to be accomplished. And this was the way to accomplish it. And they did it. And as we sit here now, and to be clear, even under Democratic rule, because of the political nature of appointments, we have Democratic elected presidents, even in the Obama administration, who elected people who are not that great on the bench, but they're there. And here we are. The federal appointment, in my opinion, is done by the most powerful senator in your state is probably the person who's making the decision of whether or not who's going to be on that federal bench. It's the president and that powerful senator in that particular state. And in New York, we know that is right now, that's Donald Trump, and it's also Chuck Schumer. If you can't get past them two hurdles, you're not getting on that bench, in my opinion. And those appointments are very important because they maintain the status quo. They set policy. There's a such thing as stare decisis. They are the individuals who control that, and that's how you ascend to the federal bench.
Wow. Okay, so I'm not sure whether or not there are any questions in the chat. So Nadine, if you want to come back in and let's maybe see if we can go through some of the questions that we may be able to have been broached through Facebook Live or through the chat.
Here's Nadine.
Unmute yourself.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So one question that we were asked was, we did answer this, but if you guys want to speak to how important this is, people believe that if they miss the primary election, that they're not allowed to vote in the regular election. And I know in New York that you're not allowed to vote in the primaries if you're not registered Democrat or Republican. So if someone wants to speak to that.
Right. So in New York, we do not have open primaries yet, right? But we were having a conversation about how the will of the people is really coming to the fore, which is an exciting time. And so we noticed, particularly in 2016 as well, is when sort of these glaring inconsistencies really came to the fore, where there are individuals who wanted to vote in the primary, but because they were registered as an independent or a member of some other party, they weren't able to vote in the New York State Democratic primary for the person of their choice. And I mean, people went, crazy about it, and which they should have, because who really pays attention to a lot of these different sort of nuances with respect to voting? When you hear about voting, you want it to be easy and you want it to be accessible. And that just wasn't an option for a number of individuals, though we did work on this in our past legislative session. So you can vote in a primary if you are registered to that particular party by which there's a primary that's taking place. However, it's also important to note that you should vote in primary elections and you should also vote in general elections, because when you skip elections, then you trigger this opportunity for the Board of Elections to what they call purge the voter rolls. And so you show up and you're like, well, I came here because, I want to vote for myself, let's say. And I know I voted here before. This is the place I vote. This is crazy. Why my name isn't on the roll? I vote here every year. And it's particularly because now there's some things that probably have been on the books for years, but are being enforced. And that's definitely, if you miss, I believe it's 2 elections, then you run the possibility of being removed from the voter roll. And then there was also this other conversation about whether or not if I have a felony. Now, I run into this a lot. I love, my community, but it is definitely a community that has been over policed, over criminalized. And when you, as we know, citizen as a part of citizenship is your ability to vote. And when you are arrested and you do time and you have a felony, they take away your rights as a citizen, because remember, again, you're stepping back into 1619 in the truest form because you've been subjected to the criminal justice system. And so they took away your right to vote, but it was just restored by act of, again, executive order by the governor. So if you had a felony and you are now presently home, you can still vote. There are no barriers for you to be able to exercise that right to vote unless you are in a state facility. Because even if you're in Rikers Island, you can still vote there as well. Your voting privileges have not been removed. So there are very many different nuances to primaries and voting in primaries and what that's about. But some of those barriers we're removing, but there's still it's still a long way for us to go.
So another question that we have is about whether with the federal government and the census, and how does that affect our resources and the representation that we have in the government?
Well, so the census, of course, it comes around every 10 years. And they've made it easy, 10 questions, 10 minutes. I also want to make a plug to say that um, the 55th Assembly District right now is only operating at 41% of a response rate. So we have to ratchet that up, because our education funding gets based on those numbers. the number of books, I don't know, in the library, or resources for libraries, the amount of apartments that gets built, the sort of AMI for these apartments in terms of how much people are making. All of that information is either a part of the census or it's a part of something called the American Community Survey. So people say all the time, I don't want the government to know where I live. They already know 9 times out of 10. So it's like, stop utilizing that as an excuse, because there are billions of dollars that are reserved for our communities. I know, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had said he went to Albany to cash a check. I mean, he went to DC to cash a check. And so, I'm going to Albany to cash one. But I need to make sure that we have something that we're able to bring home to our communities. And really, the only way that we can ensure that is by having the numbers that we need. Now, we're going to be going through another level of redistricting. We are seeing communities change and the demographics of our communities change. And we, at one point in time, was a voting rights district in Brooklyn, in Queens, and in Manhattan, the Bronx. And we're losing that because of a Supreme Court case. We talked about the Supreme Court, but also now we have to find the numbers of majority minority communities. So you have to exist, otherwise they're going to start drawing lines around you because they can't find you in the system. And we want to make sure that the representation that you have matters, that there is a continuity with respect to what issues are important to us, so that there's some commonplace in the person who elects us. I mean, the person who represents us, and the issues that they're going to go up and talk about. And so we think it's very important for each and every one of us to be involved in the census, fill out the census, because the lines are going to be drawn. Representation matters. Who gets elected matters. We need more Black women and more Black men in elected office, in higher office, in all offices, all across the board. And the only way that we can ensure that is by showing up and being counted and being heard.
Okay, and we have another question about voter suppression. Ken, I know you have, I don't know which one of you would be better for this. So I haven't heard this here. I have heard this happen in other states already. Maryland and Georgia have had envelopes that were mailed out that were already sealed. And they want to know, have the other states heard of this going on? And some people they weren't able to mail their ballots back in.
I mean, I'm sure Assemblywoman Walker could testify to it, just the details of what happens in that voting booth. But voter suppression is a narrative that is strong in the American voting system, particularly when you're talking about people of color and Black people. That's something that always exists. It's done through misinformation. It's done through subterfuge. It is always been a vibrant tool in the American political system. And when you look at American politics, there's Supreme Court cases today that address that. That's still a very important issue. It's not just the southern states, it's the northern states. As Malcolm said, anywhere south of Canada is the South. So, everyone has their own particular thing that they have to deal with. But voter suppression is a strong American narrative.
Okay, and now we have a two-part question. With regards to the DA and how he sets the tone for what's going to be prosecuted. Ken, you worked in the DA's office. Mm-hmm. Assemblywoman Walker, this is going to be a dual question. When it comes to electing the DA, and with your bill, when bail reform went through, how intricate was it that Eric Gonzalez, what his stance on bail reform, how did that affect how your bill was executed?
Well, let me say that our DA is a very progressive DA, and probably one of the most progressive that I've ever met.
Definitely in the
And
country.
yes, and so he's a leader there, and it's funny because when he was going through his process, I would tell everyone that whenever it was that I had a question, even as a staffer, and I would reach out to District Attorney Ken Thompson, I would, have this whole elaborate, conversation, and I just know he's going to give me some profound answer. And he's like, call Eric. And so it really, it was really exciting for me to be able to see that losing such a legal giant, that we really had that level of a natural progression with a leader to be able to carry out a progressive mission really in our criminal justice system. And ideally, he supported bail and bail reform. But as we heard, there is a strong district attorneys association that didn't feel as progressive, definitely not as he was. Though I still think that there were some concerns that Eric as a district attorney still had about bail. But there was this idea that, this bill is gonna just let everybody, out, and no one's ever gonna have bail. And really, I was just, trying to live out the creed of the Constitution that bail shouldn't be cruel and unusual punishment. And but of course, we bumped into a lot of roadblocks with respect to the political process, right? Because these district attorney associations and the sergeant associations and the PBA, they all got on their high horses.
Yeah.
And they organized themselves in Albany to be able to begin the rollback of bail. And
Yeah.
I almost feel like, if this climate
They did it in a pandemic.
in the in the
Middle
middle
of
of
the
a
night.
pandemic, right? And so in the middle of the night, in the middle of a pandemic, and it was an extremely frustrating situation. But now we're in this eureka moment, like, you know what? They were right. How about that? That's the only thing that we were having a conversation about. There's no reason for so many people to be held bail unjustifiably and unjustly. And but now we one of the things that I learned a long time ago from one of my mentors, Esmeralda Simmons, she says, freedom may have taken us 400 years to achieve, but it's going to take us an eternity to protect it. And so the criminal justice agenda that we've had, we're going to go back and definitely continue to fight. We've made some profound changes recently with changing 50A, removing the chokehold, doing a right to monitor. So if someone is engaged in the police, like I've been told, Kenneth, that when I would show up on the scene with my iPhone, sort of videotaping what I see in an arrest, the police officer would tell the young person, "Oh, because she's standing here with her camera phone, we have to arrest you." And then the young person's like, "Miss, please just go." But now we have the right to be able to do that. And the DA has his Justice 2020 initiative. There's some great suggestions on things that we can change with respect to that. And a lot of the things that, we need to change, he's already been doing it. So it makes the conversation and the narrative that much easier, knowing that I have a supportive district attorney who generally sees eye to eye with the people that he represents.
Yeah, and I think in New York City, the district attorneys, they're in a difficult position. It's a political position, but in many ways, it's the least political position in comparison to some of the other political offices. What the district attorney's offices, particularly district attorneys who are progressive, because here I'm of the belief, I don't expect the district attorney's office to be if in a fair society, the district attorney's office is the cheerleader for criminal justice reform, we are in a really bad space. But if you happen to have a district attorney's office that are progressive in that regard, Ken Thompson, Krause, Eric Gonzalez, then that's a plus for the community, right? It's not always going to be the district attorney's office and the community may not always be in sync, but that is certainly a plus. The problem in a city like New York is the New York City Police Department is very powerful, and they are very savvy. They understand what fear mongering is. And fear mongering has always been used when you are talking about criminal justice, because when you're talking about criminal justice, a lot of people don't want to talk about it. You're talking about Black people. And when you're talking about Black and Hispanic people, now you're talking about systemic racism and a history of marginalization. When you have a district attorney's office who is receptive to that, immediately the police department is going to take offense and they're going to dig their heels in. And then you're talking about New York City Police Department budget rivals probably some countries, and certainly some states. They have been very savvy at utilizing the press, very savvy after going after certain judges. They've gone after state judges. There's no mistake that judges who actually think and use their brain find themselves in the New York Post or the Daily News the following morning for making an intelligent decision that judges should make. There's no mistake that a federal judge like Shira Shinlin, when she challenged stop and frisk, that the New York City Police Department and their commissioner and the mayor at the time went after her. The district attorney's office is not beyond that either. They will do what they can to put the district attorney who they feel is against them on Front Street. So who you vote for district attorney is very, very important, because if you vote for people who are willing to fold in the face of criticism from other institutions in the city, in the state, then you are doing your community a disservice. And unfortunately, that's been the history here in New York. But I think it's very important to vote for district attorney. I think the district attorney's job, obviously, is to address crime, but their job should be to address crime fairly, not through discrimination, not through fear mongering, but understanding that there are reasons why crime is occurring. Crime isn't occurring in Brownsville because people in Brownsville are more prone to crime. No, I guarantee you, if you went to Upper East Side and you went to Park Slope and you bankrupt that community and you remove the opportunity from that community and you honed in on that community, they will make the same decisions that the people in Brownsville are making. But they've never been in that position. And that's what it's about. But when you have a district attorney's office who's receptive to the underlying factors that cause crime, so they're thinking about programs. They're thinking about not just programs for drugs, nonviolent crimes, but programs for violent crimes, for young kids who find themselves in the crosshairs at a very, very early age. I think that the community is better served. But picking a district attorney is very important.
And the last question we're going to take for the evening states, the 40-year federal voter suppression law expired in 2017. Is there any political action that can be taken to reinstate this law prior to the November 2020 general president election? And then the second part to that was, you don't have to get into this heavy because tomorrow's going to be a whole conversation on the Black community and the police department. But this question is, what political actions do you suggest for police reform at a federal level?
At a federal level, I'll tackle that question. I think at a federal level, I think ultimately, I think sometimes we put too much in legislation. Legislation is very important. But legislation often reacts to what's happening on the ground floor in grassroots organization. And I think if we started reinvesting in grassroots organization on the ground level, we will end up affecting police reform on a federal level. Ultimately, I think it's something like Assemblywoman Walker just stated. Ultimately, the goal should be to remove the militarized police presence in our communities. That should be the ultimate goal. And I have a bunch of ideas on that. I'm not going to get too much into tonight because, as you said, we're going to talk about that. But I think ultimately that should be the goal. Understand the federal system is a very rigid system. These judges who sit on the appellate courts are far removed from Mother Gaston and Sutter. They're far removed from Vernon and Troop. They're far removed from Monroe houses in the Bronx. So we have to be very careful. That's just one area or strategy to address. Ultimately, the grassroots organization to remove even the presence of having police in our community in the way that they are. There's a book that I want everyone to read. It's called From the War on Crime to the War on Poverty by Elizabeth Hinton. And it talks about the role that the federal government has played in mass incarceration and the over-policing of our communities.
What's the name of the book again, Ken?
It's called From the War on Crime to the War on Poverty by Elizabeth Hinton.
From the wrong?
From the war.
Okay.
War on crime.
Okay.
To the war on poverty.
Oh, okay. From the war on crime.
It explains step by step why we're where we're at today and how we got there.
So I just wanted to add that one of the, I think, important reasons, well, one important reason that I think for us to be able to change laws on a federal level is because we want to have exact justice, right? And if there is, another situation where there's a police involved shooting, we want the outcome to be the same in New York as it is in California, as it is in Wisconsin, as it is in South Carolina. And the only way that we can get a floor across the nation is if the federal government gets involved and change those dynamics. So one of the things that we heard from Ashley, let's say for instance, is the fact that from a national perspective, we would be able to sort of go after some of these kind of state houses to bring them into conformity. So New York State just banned the chokehold. And there are other states where the chokehold is banned as well, but there's still a long way to go in order for us to get to that level of consensus. And when that happens, it helps to elevate, or it helps to make the role of Congress a little easier, because the states are almost, all across the board equal with respect to the fact that we think the chokehold needs to be removed. Or let's say, for instance, the conversation regarding qualified immunity at the federal level. That's 58 with us, right? If there are circumstances that the public needs to know about with respect to a police officer, we need to be able to request those documents and get the information that we need in order to make the determinations that are justifiable and required. And we don't want to be able to get, better answers in New York than we can get in North Carolina. And so it's important for the federal government to really be, sort of in sync and progressive as well. And one of the things that we noticed too, there was a mass shooting, right, in Brownsville last year during Old Timers Week.
Old Timers Day. I was there.
I was gonna say he was
Yeah,
there. He posted, he was one.
we were all out.
Oh, where did she go? Hold on one second. Hold on one second. I have to put it back. Here she is. Hold on.
There she is.
Hold on. Let me unmute you. Let me unmute you. Go ahead. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
So yeah, I had to have my backup. But one of the things that we recognized with that shooting was that there were resources that could be made available at the federal level to help supplant some of the work it is that we're doing in our communities to make them sort of address these issues or underlying issues with respect to, fighting crime or stopping gun trafficking to come into our neighborhoods. And once we were able to get the mayor to acknowledge that that was a mass shooting, then now we can get access to all of these other federal resources. So again, the federal government provides a certain layer and level of protection to states through finances, through resources that we can drive home in order to be of service to our community. So as we just saw with the pandemic, there's a lot of work that can be done on a state level with respect to individuals and businesses. But it wasn't until the PPP or the SAFE Act that I said the SAFE Act because I'm thinking guns, or what's the name of the federal legislation?
Which one?
CARES
Act.
Act.
CARES Act.
CARES Act. I know. Sometimes I'm like SAFE Act, CARES Act.
That's all right.
But we know that the CARES Act provided a level of support that we were able to get to the individual people. So, it's important for us to be able to drive these points home at the federal level, particularly through just one size, one slice justice. As well as the resources that we need to combat the underlying issues to begin with.
So that will conclude this evening's talk on politics, policy, the vote, and organizing. So if anyone has any questions that they'd like us to answer, please feel free to message at the Real Latrice Walker on Facebook, and we'll get back to you with any questions. And please, do either of you have anything else you want to add? They'll see you guys tomorrow because you both are coming back to discuss policing and the Black community. You're muted again.
I know.
Oh.
So yeah, thanks everyone for joining in with us. And Ken, you were amazing. So we really appreciate your insight. Because again, a lot of the time we don't recognize that when we think politics, we think this big broad stroke, but it really, goes down to an exact science that affects each and every one of us on a very local level, on a very basic level. And you really helped us to sort of make sure that people can acknowledge where the rubber meets the road. But this doesn't conclude our week-long series. So please come back tomorrow where I'm sure we're going to be talking about some great things, dynamics, defunding the police department, not getting rid of the police department, but putting, money where our priorities are.
Absolutely.
And our priorities are no longer on the mass incarceration of Black people. It's going to be about putting it in our healthcare, putting it in our education.
Crime has been trending down for 20 years.
Yeah, well, it's
that
time. It's
all right,
time.
it is that time. Thank you for having me, Assemblywoman Walker. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you
I'm
so
gonna
much.
get some sleep. I'll be back tomorrow.
Yes, everyone have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.